All right, in this video, we're going to look at performing reflections of functions across the x and y axis. So many of the videos in this section are the function version of what you learned for transforming shapes in geometry class. So you talked about translations, left, right, up, and down. You talked about dilations. You talked about reflections across maybe an axis or a line. So in this one, we're going to look at reflections of functions across the x and y axes. So let's look at the square root function. F of x is the square root of x. Let's look at what happens if we take that square root function and make it negative. So multiply the function by a negative. So here we have our square root parent function. And once I activate this graph, it'll show what the result is going to be for g of x. So think about it. See if you can guess what it's going to be. You really got a 50% chance of guessing. Hope you get it right. And here we go. So it reflected the f of x graph, square root, across the x-axis. So yeah, that's what happens when we make our function negative. So now let's look at what happens when we move the negative from outside to inside. So now we're going to look at the square root of negative x. So I'm just going to delete this. And you probably know, or I'm guessing you know what's going to happen if we multiply our input values, or our x, by a negative instead of the whole thing. And lo and behold, probably what you thought, it reflects it over the y axis. So making the whole thing negative outside the function flips it over the x-axis. Making just the inputs negative, or making it negative inside the function, reflects it over the y-axis. So when we multiply by -1, we're going to reflect our graph across either the x-axis or the y-axis. So if the negative sign is outside the function, it's across the x-axis. If it's inside the function, it's across the y-axis. So it's all about location, just like with translations, adding, subtracting. Is it outside the function or inside the function? So all right, example 4, we have list the parent function to indicate the axis it is reflected across. So example A, we have g of x is the cube root of negative x. Well, our parent function is the cube root of x. So I don't know if I can make this, yeah, it worked. Cube root of x, and then g of x is the cube root of negative x. So cube root CBRT negative x. And what actually happens is it actually is a reflection across the x-axis, or the y-axis rather, because our negative is inside the function. So it's a reflection across the y-axis. However, because of the properties of the cube root function, it also looks like it's reflected over the x-axis as well. However, based on the location of the negative sign, because the negative sign is inside the function, it technically is a reflection over the y-axis and not the x-axis. All right, part B, we have negative absolute value of x. So our parent function is absolute value of x. And we're going to make g of x to be brutal. There we go. Okay. We're going to make g of x to be the absolute value of x, but we're going to put the negative outside the function, which, as we can see, reflects it over the x-axis. So we reflected over the x-axis, and that's all we have for this video. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.